January 1945, Western Germany. A grey dawn presses low over a frozen road lined with shattered trees. Snow mixes with ash, drifting through the smoke that hangs just above the ground. Somewhere ahead, a German 75mm anti-tank gun sits dug into the earth, its crew already confident. They have the range, they have the angle, they have destroyed American tanks before. The first Sherman appears through the haze, then another. The gun fires, a flash, steel shrieks. One tank erupts in flame, its turret blackened, the crew scrambling out or disappearing inside the smoke. The German crew watches, steady, almost calm. This is how it usually ends. But then the sound changes. More engines, louder, closer. Another Sherman pushes forward, tracks grinding over debris, passing the wreck still burning beside the road. It does not slow. Behind it, more silhouettes emerge, spaced deliberately, advancing into fire that should have stopped them. For the German crew, something feels wrong. This is not how armoured combat is supposed to work. What they are witnessing is not recklessness. It is doctrine, industry and human endurance colliding on the battlefield, a pattern repeated across Western Europe as American Shermans kept advancing under relentless fire. That moment of disbelief leads directly into the forces that made it inevitable. By the winter of 1944-1945, the war in Western Europe had entered its final, most unforgiving phase. The rapid breakthroughs of Normandy were months behind. The optimism of liberation had given way to exhaustion, mud, snow, and attrition. Both sides understood the stakes. Germany was fighting to delay the inevitable. The United States and its allies were racing against time, weather, and casualties to force the war to an end. On paper, the imbalance was obvious. The German army, once defined by mobility and initiative, was now stretched thin across collapsing fronts. Fuel shortages crippled manoeuvre. Replacement crews arrived with minimal training, yet one advantage still seemed to belong to Germany: armoured firepower. The Panther and Tiger tanks loomed large in Allied intelligence reports and frontline rumour. Their thick frontal armour and high-velocity guns had proven capable of destroying American tanks at long range. German anti-tank weapons, from the 75mm pack guns to handheld Panzerfausts, turned forests, villages and narrow roads into killing zones. Against these weapons stood the most common American tank of the war, the M4 Sherman. The Sherman was never designed to win duels against the heaviest German armour. American planners knew this before the first tank ever rolled off the assembly line. Instead, the Sherman was built around a different philosophy, one rooted in reliability, speed of production, and the assumption that tanks would not fight alone. By late 1944, that philosophy was being tested daily. American armoured divisions advanced through terrain that favoured the defender. The hedgerows of Normandy had given way to the dense forests of the Hurtgen, the frozen ridgelines of the Ardennes, and the narrow road networks of Western Germany. Visibility was limited. Ambushes were frequent. German crews, many of them veterans, learned to wait patiently for the first shot, aiming for side armour, command vehicles, or lead tanks. They expected results, and often they got them. Shermans burned, crews were killed, units recorded losses that would have shattered smaller armies. Yet the advance continued. Roads cleared one tank at a time. Villages fell after repeated armoured assaults. German after-action reports began to note something unsettling. Not just the presence of American tanks, but their persistence. This persistence was not accidental. It was the product of an industrial and logistical system unlike anything Germany could still field. By 1944, the United States was producing tanks, engines, radios, and spare parts at a scale that made replacement routine rather than exceptional. A destroyed Sherman was tragic, but it was not decisive. Another would arrive, often within days, sometimes within hours. Equally important was the human system built around those machines. American tank crews rotated through training centres that emphasised coordination, gunnery under stress, and mechanical familiarity. Crews knew their tanks were vulnerable. They also knew their role. They were not lone knights. They were one element in a larger formation designed to keep moving forward. German doctrine had once emphasised similar combined arms principles, but by this stage of the war, those principles were increasingly difficult to execute. Infantry support was thin, artillery ammunition was rationed, air cover was rare. German tank crews often fought isolated, holding key ground while waiting for orders that never came. As the front lines compressed, these crews found themselves engaging wave after wave of American armour. Each engagement followed a familiar script. The first kill, the second, the smoke, the fire, and then something new. The advance did not stop. Understanding why requires looking deeper, beyond production numbers and armour thickness, into the strategic pressures, battlefield assumptions and opposing doctrines that brought these forces into repeated collision. By the final year of the war, both sides carried deeply ingrained expectations about how armoured combat should unfold. These expectations shaped decisions made in seconds: when to fire, when to advance, when to withdraw. And it was precisely these assumptions that began to fracture under the weight of repeated encounters with American Shermans. German armoured doctrine had been forged in an era of manoeuvre and decisive engagement. From Poland to France, early war successes reinforced the belief that superior gunnery, positioning and armour would break enemy formations quickly. Tanks were meant to destroy other tanks. Anti-tank guns were placed to dominate likely approaches. When the first shots landed, the enemy was expected to halt, reorganise or retreat. That logic still held, in theory. But by 1944, the battlefield had changed. Germany no longer dictated tempo. Instead, German units were tasked with delaying advances they could not stop permanently. This created a subtle but critical shift. Each engagement was no longer about victory, but about inflicting maximum damage before being overwhelmed. American doctrine approached the problem from the opposite direction. US armoured forces did not expect Shermans to defeat Panthers or Tigers in frontal duels. That role belonged to tank destroyers, artillery, infantry with bazookas, and increasingly tactical air power. The Sherman's role was to advance with infantry, exploit breakthroughs, and maintain pressure. Losses were anticipated. What mattered was momentum. This distinction mattered most under fire. When a German gun destroyed a Sherman, the crew often expected the advance to pause. Smoke usually meant confusion. Burning wrecks were psychological barriers as much as physical ones. In earlier wars, such sights often marked the end of an attack, but American units were trained not to stop unless ordered. Tank commanders were taught to drive past knocked-out vehicles, not around them. The path forward was more dangerous, but hesitation invited worse outcomes. Doctrine emphasized aggression not as bravery, but as necessity. Strategic pressure reinforced this mindset. By late 1944, Allied leadership understood that Germany's defeat depended on continuous advance. Every delay gave the German army time to regroup, dig in, or shift reserves. The cost of stopping often outweighed the cost of pressing forward. German forces felt this pressure intimately. Fuel shortages meant tanks were sometimes held in reserve, unable to maneuver once engaged. Crews were ordered to hold positions even when withdrawal might have preserved equipment. As a result, many German tankers found themselves fighting static battles. Excellent conditions for ambush, but disastrous once discovered. Reports from the front began to reflect a growing unease. German units noted that American armour seemed insensitive to losses. That description was not meant as praise. It was an expression of disbelief. The expectation that destruction would produce hesitation was proving unreliable. This psychological disconnect widened with every engagement. Sherman crews understood their vulnerability. Many wrote later of knowing that a single well-placed shot could kill them. Yet they also understood that stopping meant exposing themselves longer. Movement, even under fire, reduced the enemy's window. It allowed artillery observers to adjust. It brought infantry closer. It forced German gunners to reveal their positions. What German crews were witnessing was not blind sacrifice, but a calculated acceptance of risk backed by overwhelming support. Each advancing Sherman was part of a system that absorbed losses without collapsing. By early 1945, this pattern had become unmistakable. German anti-tank crews could destroy American tanks, sometimes several in a single engagement, and still find the advance continuing. The battlefield no longer behaved according to older rules. That realization set the stage for the deeper forces at work, the human, tactical, technological, and psychological angles that defined these encounters and pushed German defenders toward a grim conclusion. The shock experienced by German crews did not come from a single factor. It emerged from the convergence of human endurance, tactical method, and a technological system designed not for perfection, but for persistence. Each engagement revealed a different angle of the same reality, that the Sherman was never meant to fight alone and never meant to stop. The human angle inside the Sherman. For American tank crews, advancing under fire was not an abstract concept. It was lived experience measured in seconds and meters. Inside a Sherman, space was tight, air grew hot quickly, and the smell of fuel and cordite clung to everything. Crews knew the statistics. They knew German guns could penetrate their armor, yet they advanced because training left little room for alternatives. Crew cohesion mattered more than armor thickness. Commanders relied on drivers to keep moving even when visibility vanished. Gunners were trained to fire rapidly, suppressing suspected positions rather than waiting for confirmed targets. Loaders worked by muscle memory, hands bruised and burned, feeding shells into the breach as the tank lurched forward. Fear was constant, but paralysis was fatal. Veterans later described the act of passing a burning Sherman as one of the hardest moments of combat. The wreck was a warning. It was also a marker, proof that someone else had already paid the price. Doctrine demanded that the advance continue. Emotion had to be set aside, often forcibly. The tactical angle. Pressure as a weapon. American armoured tactics emphasised sustained pressure. When one tank was knocked out, others were expected to manoeuvre, flank or advance through the same fire zone to force German gunners to relocate. Anti-tank crews relied on concealment and timing. Once revealed, they became targets. Artillery integration amplified this effect. Forward observers moved with armoured units, calling down fire within minutes of identifying resistance. Even if Sherman suffered losses, the enemy position rarely remained intact for long. German crews understood this sequence well. Fire, relocate, hide, repeat. But relocation required fuel, time and space, all increasingly scarce. This created a narrowing window. Every shot fired risked exposure. Every success invited retaliation. The Sherman's greatest strength was not its gun or armour, but its reliability. Engines started in cold weather. Tracks were easily repaired. Radios worked consistently, allowing units to coordinate under fire. A tank that could move and communicate remained dangerous even when outmatched on paper. German tanks, by contrast, often suffered from mechanical fragility. Panthers and Tigers delivered devastating firepower, but breakdowns were common. Crews sometimes abandoned perfectly intact vehicles simply because they could not be repaired in time. Each immobilized tank reduced German flexibility further. To American crews, this imbalance was invisible. What they saw was simpler. If they kept moving, support would follow. If they stopped, isolation increased. From the German perspective, this was deeply unsettling. Destroying an enemy tank had always been a marker of success. Now it felt temporary. The battlefield absorbed losses and continued to flow forward. These angles converged repeatedly, turning isolated engagements into patterns. For German defenders, the realization grew clearer with every fight. Stopping the Shermans required more than skill or courage. It required time and resources they no longer possessed. That realization would soon be tested in full. In moments when firepower peaked, losses mounted, and the logic of persistence was pushed to its breaking point. As engagements multiplied across France, Belgium and Germany, the remaining angles revealed themselves not in isolated battles, but in cumulative effect. Each clash eroded assumptions on both sides, reshaping how the war was experienced by those fighting it. The German perspective, confidence to disbelief. For German tank and anti-tank crews, the early moments of an engagement often confirmed their expectations. Range estimation was precise, camouflage was effective. The first shot usually struck home. Training and experience had not failed them. What followed was harder to accept. German after-action reports increasingly noted the same phenomenon. American tanks continued advancing even after sustaining losses that, in earlier campaigns, would have broken an attack. The language used was restrained, but the implication was clear. Firepower alone was no longer decisive. This challenged the psychological foundation of German defensive doctrine. Crews relied on the belief that their weapons would impose caution. When that caution failed to appear, doubt crept in. Doubt forced hesitation, and hesitation under fire was deadly. Some German crews adapted, allowing American armor closer before firing, aiming for catastrophic kills rather than suppression. Others conserved ammunition, waiting for high-value targets. But these adjustments carried risk. Every delay gave American forces time to deploy artillery, infantry, or air support. Leadership and command philosophy. American leadership accepted loss as an operational reality. This was not callousness, but calculation. Commanders understood that halting armoured advances invited counterattacks and prolonged fighting. Orders emphasized maintaining contact, even under unfavourable conditions. German commanders faced the opposite problem. They were tasked with holding ground without the means to do so indefinitely. Orders to stand fast often came without realistic expectations of reinforcement or resupply. This trapped crews in static positions, where eventual destruction or withdrawal was inevitable. The contrast in command philosophy manifested at the front line. American units adjusted rapidly, redistributing forces as needed. German units, constrained by rigid orders and limited mobility, absorbed pressure until they broke. The moral and psychological angle attrition warfare exacted a psychological toll. For American crews, the knowledge that replacements and reinforcements were coming provided a grim reassurance. For German crews, the opposite was true. Losses were often permanent. Each destroyed vehicle was one less tool available tomorrow. This imbalance shaped morale. German crews fought with determination, but increasingly without hope of changing the outcome. American crews fought knowing the war was moving in their favour, even when individual battles were costly. By late 1944, this psychological divide was evident on the battlefield. German defenders could still inflict damage, sometimes severe, but they could no longer impose strategic pause. The advance absorbed shock and continued. These forces, human endurance, tactical pressure, technological reliability, leadership philosophy, and psychological momentum, converged toward a series of decisive encounters. In those moments, expectations collapsed entirely, and the reality of relentless advance revealed itself in brutal clarity. The stage was set for a turning point where disbelief turned into resignation, and where the logic of persistence reshaped the battlefield beyond recovery. February 1945, the western approaches to the Rhine. The landscape narrows here. Forests press close to the roads. Villages cluster around stone bridges and rail crossings. Every approach has been studied, registered, and sighted in by German defenders who know they are running out of time. In the early hours, American armoured columns begin to move. Shermans advance in staggered formation, engines low, infantry hugging the tree line. The ground is frozen hard, amplifying sound. German anti-tank guns wait in silence, their crews disciplined, fingers numb on firing lanyards. They allow the lead elements to pass before opening fire. The first hit is precise. A Sherman halts, smoke pouring from its engine deck. Minutes later, another is struck from the flank. The road begins to clog with wreckage, exactly as planned. German gunners reload methodically, confident they have sealed the approach. But then the rhythm breaks. American tanks do not reverse. They do not disperse into cover. Instead, the next Shermans push forward, threading between burning hulks, tracks scraping steel. Infantry fans out, firing into suspected positions. Artillery rounds begin to fall deeper behind the German line, cutting off withdrawal routes. Time becomes compressed. German crews fire again and again. Each shot is followed by return fire, not always from tanks but from mortars, machine guns and artillery observers who now have clear reference points. Radio traffic on the German side grows urgent. Ammunition is running low. Relocation is impossible without exposing vehicles. The Americans are closer now, close enough that range advantage no longer matters. Within hours, what began as a controlled defense turns into a fight for survival. Individual guns are knocked out by indirect fire. Infantry positions are overrun. Some German tanks engage at point-blank range, destroying Shermans only meters away. Yet the advance does not stop. American losses are severe. Unit logs record multiple vehicles destroyed in single engagements. Medics move continuously. Replacement tanks are already being routed forward from rear depots. By midday, the road is open. For German crews who survived the engagement, the realization is unavoidable. They have executed their orders correctly. They have inflicted damage, and it has changed nothing. This moment, repeated across the front, marks the collapse of expectation. The belief that enough firepower could impose control has failed. What remains is delay, not defense. That truth will become unmistakable as the fighting reaches its most decisive phase. By the afternoon, the battlefield bears the unmistakable signs of attrition. Wrecked Shermans line the road, some still smouldering, others reduced to twisted frames under a grey sky. Snow around them is stained dark, churned by tracks and boots. The air carries the sharp smell of burned fuel and explosive residue. German resistance fractures not in a single collapse, but in segments. Isolated anti-tank positions continue firing until ammunition is exhausted or the crews are silenced. Individual German tanks attempt counterattacks, emerging from concealment to strike advancing columns. Some succeed briefly, destroying one or two vehicles before being targeted by overwhelming fire. American coordination tightens as the engagement unfolds. Tank commanders adjust formations, closing distances deliberately. Infantry moves closer, suppressing Panzerfaust teams before they can fire. Artillery shifts forward, firing by map reference and radio correction, saturating likely fallback positions. By late afternoon, German command cohesion erodes. Radio contact fails. Orders arrive too late or not at all. Crews begin withdrawing on their own initiative, abandoning positions that no longer serve a purpose. Vehicles short on fuel are destroyed by their own crews to prevent capture. The realization spreads quietly among German defenders. This is no longer a battle that can be shaped. It can only be endured. As darkness approaches, American units consolidate their gains. Engineers clear wreckage from the road, working under intermittent fire. Replacement tanks arrive, crews briefed quickly, engines still warm from transport. The advance schedule resumes. For German crews watching from shattered tree lines or retreating along secondary roads, the lesson is unmistakable. The Shermans will keep coming. Losses will be absorbed. Firepower alone will not halt the flow. This turning point is not defined by a single breakthrough, but by the erosion of belief. The battlefield has revealed a new reality, one in which resilience outweighs superiority and momentum proves decisive. What follows is not immediate defeat, but inevitability. The consequences will echo beyond this road, shaping the final weeks of the war and redefining how armoured combat is understood. Those consequences unfold in the aftermath. In the days following the engagement, the battlefield is quiet in a way that only exhaustion can produce. Smoke drifts from wrecks left where they fell. Engineers mark damaged vehicles for recovery or salvage. Graves are dug close to the road, temporary, precise, and anonymous. American unit reports list losses with clinical clarity. Shermans destroyed, crews killed or wounded, yet alongside these numbers are entries that matter more to higher command. Objectives taken, roads opened, timetables maintained. The advance has not stalled. German records, where they exist, tell a different story. Reports emphasize ammunition expenditure, destroyed enemy armor, and disciplined resistance. But between the lines runs a consistent admission. Positions could not be held. Firepower inflicted damage but failed to impose control. Casualty figures reveal the imbalance. German losses, particularly among trained armoured crews, are irreplaceable. Each destroyed tank represents not just steel, but experience that cannot be quickly restored. American losses, while heavy, are absorbed by a replacement system already in motion. Psychologically, the effect is profound. German survivors describe a growing sense of futility. Success is measured not by victory, but by delay. Hours gained, kilometers slowed. The expectation of stopping an attack fades. What remains is endurance without illusion. American crews process the aftermath differently. Relief mixes with grief. They mourn lost comrades, then move on. Replacement crews arrive, often younger, quickly integrated into units that continue advancing. There is little time for reflection. Strategically, the consequences are immediate. Roads once considered defensible are reclassified as temporary obstacles. German planners begin shifting emphasis from holding ground to delaying crossings, demolishing bridges, and preparing fallback positions closer to the Rhine. The American command reads the same signs with confidence. Resistance remains dangerous but predictable. Losses are factored into planning. Armoured thrusts are scheduled with the assumption that some vehicles will not return. German doctrine, built around decisive engagement, struggles to adapt. Anti-tank weapons remain lethal, but their strategic impact diminishes. The battlefield no longer responds as expected to destruction. This shift does not end the fighting. If anything, it intensifies it. But the nature of the struggle has changed. The war has entered a phase where outcomes are determined less by tactical brilliance than by systemic endurance. The deeper consequences of this reality extend beyond immediate battles, reshaping doctrine, technology, and the final approach to victory. As the Western Front continues to contract, the implications of these encounters spread far beyond individual roads and villages. They reshape planning rooms, training manuals, and post-war memory, not through dramatic proclamations, but through quiet adjustment. German commanders, increasingly realistic about their limitations, abandon any remaining hope of restoring mobile armoured warfare. Fuel shortages alone make such ambitions impossible. Instead, the focus turns to delay through demolition, urban fighting, and last-ditch defensive belts. Armour becomes reactive rather than decisive, committed sparingly and often too late. The shock experienced by German crews hardens into grim acceptance. Veterans later recall that by early 1945, the sound of American engines no longer carried surprise, only calculation. How long could this position hold? How much damage could be inflicted before withdrawal became inevitable? The Panther and Tiger, once symbols of dominance, lose their psychological weight. Their guns still kill, their armour still resists. But neither can reverse momentum. Mechanical failures, lack of spare parts, and dwindling crews strip them of strategic relevance. A superior weapon system without a supporting structure becomes a liability rather than an advantage. On the American side, the lessons are absorbed almost subconsciously. The Sherman's reputation remains contested even among its own crews. They know its weaknesses intimately. Yet command assessments emphasize something else entirely, that the tank fulfilled its intended role. It moved when ordered. It communicated reliably. It could be replaced. Post-war analysis will later confirm what frontline commanders already understood. The Sherman was a component in an industrial and doctrinal system designed to keep advancing regardless of loss. Its effectiveness lay not in dominance, but in consistency. This understanding influences future doctrine. American armoured development after the war prioritizes survivability, crew protection, and firepower, but never at the expense of logistics and reliability. The memory of advancing through wreckage, of absorbing losses without halting, becomes a foundational lesson rather than a celebrated one. Diplomatically, the collapse of German armoured resistance accelerates the endgame. Allied forces approach the Rhine with confidence that resistance, while fierce, cannot alter the outcome. German leadership, increasingly fragmented, confronts the reality that even tactical success no longer translates into strategic leverage. The relentless advance reshapes the final months of the war. Cities fall not because they are undefended, but because defense no longer changes anything. The battlefield has spoken repeatedly in the same language. And as the guns begin to fall silent, one truth remains clear. The shock felt by German crews was not caused by a single tank or battle, but by the emergence of a new model of war, one where resilience outweighs superiority and persistence proves decisive. That truth invites reflection. The shock experienced by German tank crews in the final year of the war was not rooted in misunderstanding or arrogance. It was born from experience. For years, armoured combat had followed patterns that rewarded precision, firepower, and tactical dominance. Destroy the enemy's machines, and the advance would falter. In Western Europe, that logic no longer held. What the Shermans represented was not invulnerability, but inevitability. American tanks burned just as German tanks did. Crews died. Units suffered losses that would have broken smaller forces. Yet the advance continued because it was never dependent on individual vehicles or isolated successes. It was sustained by an industrial system, a command philosophy, and a doctrine that accepted loss as part of movement rather than a signal to stop. This was not heroism in the romantic sense. It was endurance under calculation. Crews advanced not because they believed they could not be killed, but because stopping exposed them to greater danger and prolonged the war. Their courage was practical, shaped by training and reinforced by the knowledge that support, artillery, infantry, replacements, was always moving behind them. For German crews, the realization was devastating. Skill and superior weapons still mattered, but they no longer decided outcomes. The battlefield no longer responded to destruction with pause. It absorbed shock and continued forward. In that moment, the foundations of earlier armoured warfare collapsed. The story of the Sherman is often told through comparison, gun versus gun, armour versus armour. But that framing misses the deeper truth revealed under relentless fire. Wars are not won by the strongest machine alone. They are won by systems that endure damage without losing coherence. By 1945, the Western Front had become a demonstration of that principle. The Shermans kept advancing not because they were unbeatable, but because they were replaceable. And in industrial war, replaceability becomes a form of strength. The stunned silence reported by German crews was the sound of realization that the war they were fighting had changed, and that persistence, not perfection, would decide its end.